And we are live on the air. Hello there, I'm Alan Levine. I am one teacher of NetNarr, which is kind of a networked class in digital stuff and art and media and internet. And I have a class there that you will be able to see in a second in New Jersey at Kean University. Why don't you guys unmute and say hello? Just everybody, like a group hello. A group hello.
Hello.
Aren't they nice? Thank you. So I'm really privileged and happy to be able to teach this class, a little bit mediated because I am at my home in Arizona and I'm teaching them remotely, but I'm highly present. Well, I like to think so. We'll let them say for that. And then I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Mia Zamora, who I worked with last year on a class from Kean, who is now 11 o'clock at night in Bergen, Norway. Hi, Mia.
Hi, such a pleasure to see all of the students in NetNarr. I'm so glad to connect this way, and such a pleasure to have Brett here. So I'm Mia Zamora. I'm currently at the University of Bergen in Norway for my sabbatical year, where I'm teaching a second iteration of this class with Alan. And this time we have a different angle on it, and we're going to focus on digital art and electronic literature and video games as well. So it should be a fun semester. I have 2 students with me tonight out of a group of 75 that I have two wonderful students, Takumi and Eric, and they're going to introduce themselves just really briefly. Eric, you want to just say hi?
Sure. I study digital culture, going for a bachelor degree right now. Otherwise, I'll just use the internet all day, play with video games, surf around. Don't really think too much about my security, but you know.
You have a great microphone.
Thank you.
Yeah. That looks professional. It sounds good.
It does. I'm impressed. Takumi, you want to say hi?
Hello. I'm Takumi. I'm an exchange student from Japan to Norway, and I'm my major is English language education in Japan, and I'm taking the course of teacher training in Japan.
Excellent. We're so glad you could join us, and I mean, this is a way of teaching. You know, I would have probably not imagined 10 years ago. And so, you know, while we're talking about some dark sides and things to worry about technology, there's a lot that enables like this to be able to like write Brett Gaylor and say, will you come visit my class? And he said, yes. So thank you, Brett.
Yeah, thank you. You too.
So I really want to introduce Brett Gaylor, who's the star of the show here. And kind of I got to know through a networked way through a mutual friend, Scott Leslie, who kind of just said, hey, you know, you two do similar things of interest. And, you know, Brett was working at Mozilla at the time, but, you know, I was already a fan because I had known of Remix Manifesto. So welcome, Brett. Thank you to the center court here.
Thanks. Well, thanks, Alan, and for inviting me. And it's fun to be here in a class, and thank you especially to the folks who are staying up late. That's thanks for your patience, and it's really fun to be here. And so yeah, I think I met Alan actually as Cogdog, the digital maker, at that time when I was working on Mozilla's webmaker project. So we had made a kind of a fun remix tool called Popcorn Maker, which sort of allowed you to kind of piece together different things from around the web and put them together in the same way that you might edit a piece of video. And this was like, I think around 2013 or 14 that we're making that. And it's kind of interesting now that that's coming up on 5 years ago, the way that the web has actually changed, that a lot of the things that we could do with Popcorn Maker are getting harder and harder to do because the web, you know, we spend so much time now in these platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and on our phones. And the stuff that we were doing at that time when I met you, Alan, was really, really celebrating this sort of networked and decentralized type of creativity. And I think that's actually, before I met you through Scott, I knew of you from Flickr, where you remained quite prolific. And so it's fun to think about the ways that's different now, and the ways that it's some ways better because it's easier to find things and it's faster. And everyone we know is doing it, as opposed to a pretty small segment of the population. But yeah, that's how I met Alan. And yeah, I'm a filmmaker and digital maker, and I still work at Mozilla. I commission other media artists who are kind of exploring the upsides and the downsides to the networked society. But yeah, super happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Just as a warning, my son got sick today and I'm home alone with him. So if you see a 6-year-old bust through that door, it's not a recreation of the BBC video, it's real life. And he's just catching up on some Netflix right now, but it could get real up in here.
That's great. I'm already thinking like, how many people know of the BBC video that Brett's referring to that went viral a couple months ago?
That was a classic. Of course, I saw it. Oh, the hands in the room back there, seems like there's familiarity. Yeah.
Yeah, the rate at which this happened. But I want to talk a little bit with Brett first about kind of film and video and digital art. But I really want to get to obviously talking about to Do Not Track. So Brett, how'd you get into video? Were you like a kid with a camera, or what was your draw into making film or video?
Yeah, so I grew up in the part of the world that I live now, and it's the sort of Pacific Northwest of Canada. And I actually grew up at a small island called Galiano Island. And on this island, a neighbor of mine, he had been sort of a amateur filmmaker. He was kind of an interesting guy who had actually moved his family to Nicaragua and started making documentaries down there. And when he came back, he bought this piece of property and some abandoned, we call them here portables in Canada. I don't know if that means anything to you, but they're often used in logging camps. And this was actually these abandoned portables from logging camps where the loggers used to stay. He bought these and he was like, what should I do with these? How about I start a film school for teenagers and he called it the Gulf Islands Film and Television School. I was in high school at that time and was actually kind of poking around with film, and I had saved up to buy a video camera. I was a skateboarder, and so I was making my first skateboard films. But to answer your question more directly, the thing that got me was we had just built a new high school where I was going to school, and they had bought all these computers. They were the first. So the PCs used to be in the x86 architecture. So there was a 286 and a 386 and a 486. And then the 586, they branded the Pentium. So these were like considered like starting to get fast computers. And they bought a computer lab of them and networked them together. And they, I don't know how they decided to do this, but they got all copies of Autodesk 3D Studio, which was like pretty interesting at the time, quite sophisticated computer animation software. And me and a couple of other people just started nerding out on this and teaching ourselves how to use it. And so my neighbor, who had started this, could have started a logging camp, instead started a film school. He was like, I need somebody who gets computers. So I'm sure all of you have had that thing where you like your aunt or uncle, like, you're good with computers, right? So that was like my neighbor. You're good with computers, right? Will you set up all the computers here? And the other sort of confluence that was happening at that time is that was like around the first years that you could start to edit on a computer, which was highly revolutionary. It seems very commonplace now, but that was such a big deal that you could digitize the footage and then edit it non-linearly. So before that, and the stuff that I was playing around with is like, you get 2 VCRs and you'd be like, record on one and play on the other, and then pause this one and then change the tape in this one to put something else in, and then press pause again so it's recording and then play on this one. the idea that you could just like have everything in the computer and then mash it up non-linearly was like hugely revolutionary, and then also just dramatically lowered the barrier for people to be able to make films. And so in that whole mosh pit of stuff, that was like around the time I was graduating high school. And so I ended up, working at this film camp, which was really fun and cool. And George, also the founder of this camp, knew a lot of filmmakers from the area. And one of these was a fellow named Velcro Ripper, who him and his partner had made this documentary film, Bones of the Forest. And it was about the deforestation and sort of colonial practices of the logging industry in British Columbia. And for me, I was like, wow, that's such a cool mix of somebody that's politically active, but is also making stuff that's really formally interesting. It was kind of punk rock. He had a lot of music. He did it all himself with his partner at the time. So it was just a small crew, them doing it. And I was like, I want to do that. And so I subsequently fooled around for a couple of years, moving around. And then I decided to go to film school in Montreal at Concordia University. And that was sort of the rest is history. Then I just pursued documentary as my thing.
It sounded like, though, the way you're talking about documentaries were kind of an interest kind of through that.
Yeah. So I definitely come from that. Those are like, that's my tribe, is the documentarians. And the fun thing about documentary is that, like, most of us would think about documentary as like documentaries that you would see on Netflix. But, for many people that practice it, that could be photography, that could be radio, that could be, it's also sort of a lifestyle of, it's you're not a journalist. You don't have any claim to, objectivity. It's like, I want to tell my truth about something as I see it. And that's it. So I see myself as that, not necessarily as a filmmaker or a digital person, but as a documentarian, like a nonfiction storyteller. And that's fun because that's the same sort of people that also, write creative nonfiction or would write for magazines. It's great. Because you get to meet a lot of different people from different vocations.
Great. Yeah, we're going to be in Mia's class. Our this is talking about digital art, and so not asking for boxing definitions whether documentaries are digital art, but I was thinking that I love that animation with OK Google that you did, and so to me, that feels like a piece of digital art, but also has a documentary flavor to it, and I really wanted to get to like the ideas and the potential for web-based documentaries, which I guess that's a genre of itself, or and maybe what you can say about what it takes to produce those, because they seem more complicated.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess thinking about documentary, the subjects I've liked to tackle personally have tended to be about the internet itself. And so for me, it's like, how do you tell, the best way to tell that story is by doing it in a way that you could only do on the internet. And then, so how do you incorporate the sort of, affordances of that medium? So like, what can you do on the internet that you can't do just on television or in a theater? So one of those things is you can like hear back from the people that are watching it. So that's what we were doing with Remix Manifesto, is as we were making it, kind of publishing all the rushes and then asking people to remix them as they were making it, or upload their own stuff, which at the time was kind of hard, and so required a lot of communication with the audience. With Do Not Track, it was about how could the person that's watching the film, because it's by design sort of meant to feel like a film, how could it incorporate information about them so that it wasn't an abstract concept about surveillance or the model of the advertising industry. It would be like apparent as you were watching it. So that's, and then I'm trying to produce one right now that's about the Internet of Things, which hopes to sort of incorporate the data that is being collected in our homes and in our cities about us, but find ways to like incorporate those objects. So that's the goal of that kind of work. Some people would call that like digital documentary or interactive or transmedia or whatever. For me, it's just a documentary. So what it takes to do that is usually you kind of have to design the system that this all takes place within. And so there's no sort of formula for how to do that. You're basically, you're trying to apply systems thinking to that. So that sounds really abstract, but with Do Not Track, the system was that you had a linear film that would progress until certain points where it would ask for information, at which point you had a branching narrative. So if you've seen it in the first episode, it sort of says like, this is what I know. I know this is where you live. I know this is the computer you live in. I know that and you might have heard like, it's a nice day, or you might have heard it's a nice night, or you might have heard it's a shitty day or a shitty night. So that's the branching that happens in there.
I thought you were just talking to me.
Yeah, good. So it worked. But when in fact, there's like a system behind that is pretty basic system, right? If this, then that kind of thinking. So that's your sort of part of what's different about the role of the director in a digital documentary is you're also kind of that's part of your job, is to come up with that vision for that, or at least that's the way I like to work. Some people would put that responsibility on a collaborator in the same way that the director might put the sort of visual aesthetic to a cinematographer. But I actually think it's pretty important for the director to have a role in that, in the same way that a good director should have that idea of what the thing is going to look like.
I'm glad you mentioned your next piece. I was going to ask about that because I was thinking like, Remix Manifesto was kind of early on the wave of an understanding about what the digital space was doing for music and the concepts of remix and rights. And I mean, Do Not Track, there's a lot of talk now about surveillance and data, but you're a little bit ahead of the curve there. So look for Internet of Things. Do you have any Internet of Things devices in your home? Any any Alexas or talk or robots or?
Well, me and my son were just playing with the Lego came out with this thing called Boost. So we made a robot. But no, I do not. I mean, I personally think it's kind of crazy to like, have you heard that story about the Alexa that was used in the lawsuit? Yeah, so there's this story about, I'm probably gonna get the details wrong here, but there was a murder and the police subpoenaed the Amazon Alexa, the owner of the home's Amazon Alexa, because the Alexa is basically always running. So it's always listening in the home, but it doesn't send anything until you give it the wake word. So you say like, Alexa, how much is a pound of hamburger meat today at the supermarket? And then it like goes and does its thing. But it's always running. And so they subpoenaed it because it locally stored that picked up the sound of the murder as it occurred, which had something to do with a hot tub. So there was like somebody coming in. So it was like when the jets went on, or there was some forensic detail that mattered in that. And so you could look at that and be like, that's great, it helped to solve a murder. Or you could look at that and be horrified that like, if the police were to be like, is it okay if we just like put this constantly running microphone in your home, just in case something bad happens, we would be able to know. And so like, if, 25 years ago, we would have been like, what a dystopic future. The police will never do that. There'll be all these checks and balances. And now we're like, oh yeah, I got it for like an extra $10 when I bought a book. So yeah, of course I put this microphone in my house, or, they're giving it away at the gas station, or it's really cool. You can check the price of hamburger meat. It's like, of course I want this in my home. So no, I don't have any IoT devices in my home. And so the project wants to look at, it sort of starts with, I don't know if you follow that Twitter account, the Internet of Shit, which is sort of like all the dumb IoT device, you know, like the Bluetooth garbage can, or like the Wi-Fi connected toothbrush, or like these silly things, which, you know, you could either, again, you could say like, those are dumb, they'll never work. Or you could say like, wait, what's going on? I thought the internet was this like thing that was going to like spread democracy, and it was going to be amazing. And instead it's, Silicon Valley has become so powerful that it's moving into areas that it did not used to exert influence over. And we're now sort of starting to see some of those consequences. So like, it's great to, I still use Airbnb, and I love it. And now we're sort of seeing that it's having a terrible effect on affordability and gentrification. I thought Uber was the coolest thing the first time I used it, and now you sort of think like, wait, aside from being total douchebags, they're putting a lot of people out of work. And you know, how do we sort of provide some checks and balances on the internet? So yeah, the trajectory from RIP of being like, let's share everything and this is going to be the most amazing thing, to now is sort of like what I'm interested in following up with.
Is there going to be an IoT aspect to the documentary? Are you still figuring that out, or?
Yeah, I am still figuring that out. But basically what we want to do is we want to model the way that we wish IoT devices worked, which was that there was some aspect of consent baked into it, so that so basically the structure is that we want to put a bunch of sensors in people's homes, but that they have complete control of what is recorded, and then take that data to different device manufacturers and say like, how would you actually, could you use this data to solve a real human problem? And then watch as they actually make these objects and sort of understand the whole ecosystem of how they're put together. But yeah, to ask some of these bigger questions.
That's great. Okay.
My battery's about to die.
Okay. While you're doing that, I'm going to invite everybody else. This is not meant to be the Alan and Brett show here. So I want to move into talking about maybe some questions you have about Do Not Track, or some commentary. You know, I'm really interested in. I mean, we're all, you know, I mean, and Brett alluded to this, you know, in the film itself, is like there's somewhat of this wrestling with these decisions about, you know, yes, I know some of these systems are tracking me, you know, but, you know, I still am in social media, or I'm still shopping on Amazon, and I'm knowing they're tracking. So, I mean, I don't know how to ask, like, how do you deal with this constant dilemma? Or maybe it's not a dilemma. Maybe people just, they kind of accept it, you know. And, you know, one of my students in their blog said they, you know, this has been the way things have been and for their lives. And it's like, it's kind of the norm of the fact that we somewhat operate as a little bit available to be seen outside of our homes. And is anybody like struggling with this, or everybody's like, oh, okay, I'm cool with being tracked? This is like an invitation to jump in. Ask Brett a question while he gets the power cord set up. Yeah, all right, from Kane. Is that a hand raise? You might have to.
I think that's like a constant struggle. I think sometimes we pretend like it's okay with us, but when we really see to the extent at which it would affect our lives and our privacy, we probably wouldn't feel beautiful. So I know, like, my Alexa, like, sometimes I won't even say Alexa, and she'll, like, just start talking out of nowhere, and that freaks me out all the time. So I had to, like, disconnect her. And I feel like there's other influences of, like, social media and stuff. Like, yeah, it's great that everyone knows where we are all the time, but, like, being in a relationship, you don't want your significant other to know where you are at all times. And the fact that they can do it and the stranger can do it is, like, you know, like Snapchat with the maps. Yeah. That's sick. Like, that's really crazy to me.
I was thinking that one of the results of your work, Brett, for me, was to start to think about the notion of privacy and what privacy means, how it's perhaps becoming a rare and more significant, more significant reality that we have to hold precious and dear and protect on some level. And I think privacy is also connected in some ways to intimacy. That is how we connect with people, how we know them, etc. Is a harder thing to navigate in this world where there's a sort of outsourcing of every move we make. And I think that just that acknowledgement then becomes ultimately a major cultural paradigm shift, right? And we're talking about human things, right? Just like, how do you feel you know somebody? But it all starts with this kind of landscape that we share, and the way we're kind of boxed out or cornered into public-facing representations of ourselves all the time, so much so that it's hard to really know the truth about someone. So I guess what I'm trying to talk about is self-representation in the digital age, and how data might play a role in that as well, in kind of concrete terms. But in the end, I think it's very haunting, the idea that privacy itself is perhaps a rare thing, and we're going through some sort of phase where everything is public-facing.
Something. Are we on? Oh, the mic's on. Okay, cool. I think what frightens me the most is this notion of the different versions of yourself that you present for, whether it be like a discourse community or just in life, kind of separate entity that you have. You have your home life, your family. I don't want to say persona, but a way that you act and communicate with family, with friends, with certain online communities, with employers, with academic institutions. The fact that a prospective employer could, through all of this linkage, find maybe like digital art or some kind of sweary video game or movie review I wrote for my friends and judge me based on that I never intended for them to see, and which would not generally influence my, my behavior or whatever in an employment situation. The fact that it's all mushed together and there really is a separate yourself if you're going to be doing online communication. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does, and I think you're right to have that concern, and I think a lot of people think about that for kids too, right? Like this notion of having a record, and like you do need as a young person that ability to explore different identities and modes of being, and I think that's true. And there's the thing that I'm starting to think about as well is not so much the like silly movie review that you wrote, but the more mundane things that are being recorded that then an algorithm is interpreting and then making decisions. So the job application thing is a really frightening one, because that is one of the first places that artificial intelligences are sort of looking at data sets and saying, well, you'll get an interview and you won't. And one of the biggest problems with that is that really bakes in a lot of the biases that already exist in our society. So if you were to say, there's an algorithm and, you put out a job application and you really only want to talk to people that have this level of education or whose work history represents this or who speak in this sort of way that indicates a certain level of education, for instance. Well, that, just by doing that, you are going to further persecute people that weren't able to access those types of opportunities before, where what we really need is sort of intelligent systems that say, like, this person, whether or not his or her work record or other data points would reveal it, is actually the best person for this job, and you should talk to them. So that's the other almost more pernicious thing that I'm concerned about is when you sort of start to collect everything, you actually don't know what that's going to be used for down the line. So Alan was referencing this film that I just made with my son, which was a fun piece. It was I discovered like a year of his Google. He was using my phone a lot, and he's only 6, so he was like, asking like what is flying and poop and gymnastics and Halloween and just like stuff the kids want to know. But who's to say that Google wouldn't? So one thing is like Google right now is using those searches to improve its search algorithm. So the sound of my son's voice is being used is like child labor to improve their capacity for search. Kind of weird. But then second of all, we don't know what Google's artificial intelligence project is going to do with that. So it might be finding correlations between things that he's looking for. It might be sort of have already put him into a category of intelligence based on what he searches for. Is it crazy to think that in 10 or 15 years that wouldn't be a predictor of his ability to get into a certain school? So those are the sort of next level of dilemmas that we need to really think about, and that we need like civil society to start to get scared about.
I wonder. I was thinking like in the first or second episode, like Ethan Zuckerberg is kind of like apologizing for doing the pop-up ad.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of other people now saying like, wow, we made a lot of mistakes when we started the internet. And so there's a lot of people like doing these mea culpas, like, do you have to be like totally like rose glasses on to be an optimist these days?
I mean, I'm definitely in that camp. It's like, oh God, what do we do? But then also you have to remember that even that is like a fairly privileged thing to think about. Like, oh yeah, like you don't forget that, that this is still the platform by which many people have access to hold, truths of power, and that. So I think folks have to be really careful not to confuse the sort of naive tech utopianism with the idea that like, oh, the internet cannot no longer be a people's platform. That would be a real shame. I think most of those mea culpas are coming from people that, we're not thinking about, we're not really thinking through these issues of equity, and they weren't thinking it through. And so, but maybe I think it could be said that they were in a position where they didn't have to. And so but maybe they are, and maybe that's part of this political moment. Maybe that's just a maturation of the discourse around digital society. Hard to say, but no, I think that there's still lots of room for optimism. And even if it is a dark time, I think it is true that so goes the internet, so goes many social movements. So it's like not really a luxury that we have.
Did you, when making the Do Not Track, did you get any like criticism from the tech industry? Did people kind of like try to, counteract, or did you get any blowback?
I think a little bit. Let's see. I think, no, most of the stuff we had was sort of like, well, I don't have any, that's not about me, because I'm not really like a super spy that needs to keep all this information secret. And that was part of the thing that we were trying to talk about, was that it's not, it's about everybody, because I think to your point, Mia, it's like privacy is what allows us to be authentic people. So no, this affects everybody. And it's like, that's why the right to privacy is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So like, no, let's not just say that it's only for some people and not for others. It's like, we have to protect everybody.
Great. I really hope some people, other people in the Hangout maybe chime in some questions having watched Do Not Track or want to talk about video production. We got the expert in the room here. He's eyeballing his door to make sure he doesn't get surprises. I might have a dog jump in the scene too. Like if I want shy people.
I had a question about how did you get the information about how they track people, like very specifically?
Yeah, so if you there's a service called Disconnect Me, and what they do is they keep sort of a database of what are called third-party cookies. So like, say when you go to the New York Times, they will put a cookie on your computer that's like, and some of those are for like, oh, recognize that it's you so you don't have to log in. But also New York Times, other websites that you aren't visiting will also drop a cookie. So that's usually an ad network or, yeah, it's usually an ad network that'll do that. And so Disconnect Me keeps a database of those, and it's constantly being updated. And then so what we did is they gave us access to that. And so when you would go and I would ask you, like, what's the website that you go to your news? There was sort of a transaction that we initiated that would ask Disconnect Me. They're like, oh, they're on Washington Post. What are the third parties? Okay, they would send it back to us, and then we would initiate that that data visualization.
So it's all public information?
Yeah, it's public information, yeah. Well, it's information they made public.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a question, because there are a lot of sites that ask our permission to do things, which, do help us, The whole thing is that if there weren't cookies, every time we went to a website, we'd have to remember every username and password, and it wouldn't remember the things in our shopping cart, et cetera. And I think some questions did come up from somewhere in the network about, what does it mean when I go to one of these things like Disconnect to Me? I have to give them permission, to be able to do what they're doing to help inform me. So, I mean, the whole Do Not Track is a way, it's ironic because you have to give the website permission to do some of the things to interact with it.
Yeah, I mean, that's I was actually talking to somebody about this project, which I'll put in the chat here, which is it's called Building Consentful Tech. I think so. A lot of these questions around online privacy, or like, Do Not Track. Some people are like, it's creepy. I don't like it. That's like the emotion that they would choose to describe it. And for me, that's usually when your expectations about something are upended, because we don't really have a word for like when. That's just like the catch-all word we use. So I think what I would like to see is technology that like builds in your consent about to gather that information, and then who it's transmitted to. So I would posit that those third-party cookies are not consentful, because while you chose to go to the New York Times, you did not really consent to somebody else gathering this data, even if it is anonymous, about you, and then using it in ways that you didn't, that you may or may not have given consent to. So that zine is pretty interesting because it's actually modeled on Planned Parenthood's model of consent, and it's interesting to look at the ways in which that's similar. So like if you look at it, it's like consent is freely given, so you weren't coerced into it. It is reversible, so you might decide it, like, oh, I'm okay with using my data in that way, and then you're like, actually, I'm not. I want you to stop doing that. It's informed, like you understand the entirety of it. It's specific, so like for this use, you can use my data. Just because I give you access to that doesn't mean you can use it in these other ways. Then it's enthusiastic. So like, yeah, I'm like, I actually am into this. and not like, oh, okay, like I guess you can use my data in that way if that's the only way that I can like get on this bus or into this event or whatever. So yeah, I think you're right, Alan, that like it's not, we don't want to say that like collecting information about people is a bad thing. Of course, that's why we have the census, and that's why, you know, social scientists need it to do their work. But it's about like, for me, it's two things. It's about that consent, and then it's also like with the project I'm doing now is like, how, are you thinking about the ways in which the things that you're building are affecting like other areas of society, like the externalities of that data capture?
But like any change in the way things are done would seem to require a great amount of cooperation from people who are making a lot of money in this environment. It feels, I don't know, I feel kind of stuck. Like how can we move forward? Some things happened with cookies from Europe because of some you know, legislation, et cetera, which is certainly not going to happen in the U.S. It just seems like how does this get unstuck and go in a different direction? Mia?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something too, which maybe is a more simplistic question or framework of thinking around these issues of, especially the, what did we say, IoT, Internet of Things. So maybe, sorry if I'm breaking it down to something super basic, but I think the super basic on some level also points us towards cultural revolutionary shifts that we need to think about. So for instance, my 10-year-old came home from school yesterday and said, "Hey mom, did you hear about that new app that you can have in your fridge, in your refrigerator, where you, when you're in the store and you're shopping, you can look inside your fridge to see what you don't have, so you can remember, like, oh, we need milk, we need butter, we need eggs." And, you know, I'm just chopping up a salad there, listening to him. And I said, who needs that? That's such a waste. But then when I started to think about it, what really bugged me about it is it's taking away our chance to like think through our lives, you know, to remember what we used and what we didn't. And sometimes we forget, which is irritating. And that's the reason why they're trying to sell a product. But in the end, it bugs me that it's taking away the little like kind of branching effects of thinking itself and what that means to concentrate, to actually put your brain towards something, walk through the steps of what you've used last to remember if you have butter or not. So I don't know, that really upsets me too, is the way in which technologies and in, you know, obviously packaged in a notion of progress are ultimately, and they're supposed to be convenient, in some ways are softening us so much when we really need to flex our brain muscles so that we can think through things. It's such an important part of how we connect with each other and build society, is that we're thinking people, right? Anyway, sorry if that's very simplistic, but on some level, I think that it's also a problem in that way.
No, oh, there it comes. If one book I would recommend, if you're worried about that, if you haven't read it, is Nicholas Kerr's The Shallows, which is a really interesting sort of scientific look at the way in which the internet has changed our brain over like 10 years. It's pretty scary. And when you read it, you're like, oh yeah, that's true. I can't read a novel the same way that I used to. And it looks at like all these case studies of the ways in which the internet has changed our brain. So yeah, if you want to get more freaked out, read that book.
Okay, Kane, who wants the fridge app? Anybody?
No, but I did have something that I wanted to say. I'm drawing a blank. Yes. To what extent do you feel that this kind of data mining or information collection, in that like the information is almost like a currency, where you need so much of it or you sell it to keep your website running? It's like a market of its own. Like how much do you feel is necessary so that like adding agencies or whatever, that keeps websites online that may have good content, but that's the only way that they can fund their website. Like, yeah, how much do you feel is necessary in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely depends on what you're making in that model. What was I going to say? At Mozilla, in the program that I run, we funded this woman, Hong Dotiduk, and she made, it's actually a pretty cool add-on that I'll just put in this chat called Data Selfie. And you install it, and it basically shows you how Facebook sees you, like what personality profiles it would put you into, and she's done all this like interesting machine learning around it to prove that. But my point is that like she has to pay that service, and because she like refuses to collect any actual data about people, she's actually basically going to have to sunset it after like 10 months because she's like, my options here are either to like collect data about you and charge you, or like sell that data to somebody else, or sunset this thing. When I was like encouraging, I was like, you should blog about that and like make that a part of the project, is that it's like a ticking clock about like, how much money they have. But it's really true that like many of these models, I think the answer to your question is like, it is necessary for the economy of the web right now. And that's a bit messed up. If the advertising model means that like, if you're going to say, you should put your ads on my platform, you should advertise your services on my platform. Don't do it on the Super Bowl, because we've got more people than the Super Bowl, and we know what they like. And it answers that like age-old question. There's this like saying in advertising that like, yeah, advertising works 50-50, 50% of the time. I just don't know which half. That was like this famous saying. And then, with digital media, they were able to say like, actually, I can just put the ad right in front of the exact right person. And that was the model. That is like, no, it's not just general people. It's people that are, we can show are interested in your project, in your product. So unfortunately, it is necessary for the model that we have. What it takes to change that is that different question. And I think for me, it's like, you can't hope to like change everything. You can sort of shift some cultural norms so that there is a group of people who would choose this other thing, which is maybe it's paying for it, maybe it's some kind of other subsidized model. But for me, it's like kind of similar to food. You're not going to get everybody to eat right and to eat, buy fair trade everything that builds an equity to the workers, but you can provide it for some people, and the more people there are, the cheaper it gets for those people, and then you start to build some network effect. And I think we'll start to see something like that in these more ethical digital technologies too.
Now, what if everything just implodes, Brett? Like, where do we go from there?
That would be okay too, as far as like, because I can't make more films about the internet after this one. So like, I need something to. Yeah, maybe if it all burns down, maybe that would be okay too.
I think we
would get less Trumps if that were happening. So yeah, we'll see.
We need a cat documentary. How about that? Any, I want to give Kane students or Mia students, Eric, Takima, any other questions before? I think Brett's probably got to go pretty soon.
I'm okay to the top of the hour.
Where do you stand on Facebook?
Yeah, because Stephanie sent a tweet a question to Brett.
Oh,
okay.
Okay.
We have too many channels.
She can't speak. Just put her hand on this remix manifesto. You want to message directly. Got it.
Did we get that question?
I don't think I got it. I see. I got something from Wendy, but I didn't get a question though.
Scouring to find it.
Okay.
Oh, here it is. Look at that. It just came in. Do you think the benefits will outweigh the cons when it comes to the age of info on the internet?
Yeah. I think it's just really important to think about like the pros and cons for whom, right? So it's just like back to what we were talking about before. You don't want to just like, I'm sick of the internet. It's not as fun, or it's like so extractive. It still is. There are people who are able to access more information than ever before. We have to make sure that that's, a version of the truth that is as objective as possible, that considers many different perspectives. I think, yes. What makes that question harder to answer, though, is just that like digital technology just feels like it's everywhere now. So it used to be that we'd talk about like, oh, it's the media landscape and access to information, and do the pros outweigh the cons? Like, yes, but now we have to think about like, oh, is it a good or a bad thing that now the sort of the growth model of digital technology is now applied to real estate or currency or medicine, all those things, and for that I'm much more skeptical that the same that the idea that you can apply the same thinking to these other aspects of like these sort of pillars of society that you currently apply to making a product and getting it in front of people and getting traction as fast as possible. I think that that's actually dangerous. The cons are winning there when it comes to digital technology. And so I think we do need to find some ways to like slow that stuff down.
I've kind of wondered, like some speculative fiction, like if the internet, if the history was different, like if it was played out in like an AOL model where it was like designed and controlled by commercial entities where we'd pay for everything, but maybe we wouldn't have nearly the range of freedom of expression that we do right now. Like what would our present now look like if the AOL model had played out?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't have had a lot of stuff. We wouldn't have had Wikipedia, and we wouldn't have had WikiLeaks. So like think about it that way. You wouldn't have had like this free access to the entire history of everything, crowdsourced by people around the world. Nor would you have had the ability to like instantly affect geopolitics, and then with questionable intent. So maybe that's like to the question of the pros and cons. It's like life. It has both pros and cons. It's just like a thing now that we have to consider, just like the ecosystem of the climate. We have this other ecosystem now that's like just rapid growth and change that's going to be with our generations and all of our moving forward. So I think everybody's kind of in this like awkward phase where they're like, how do we, so if like regulation isn't the thing that's going to control that, nor is and we don't really have any other answer, like how do we find this sort of ethical core to guide the creation of that technology now? And in absence of it, I think that's what makes everybody kind of nervous.
It almost feels like we're waiting for that to like emerge from somewhere, and it isn't.
Yeah, or we're like, Black Mirror, William Gibson kind of thing, and it is, you sort of see more examples of that. I mean, I remember like the first time I saw a self-driving car whiz by me, I was like, okay, this is weird. This is getting weird now.
So,
yeah. I'm
Maybe
optimistic.
as a last question, because I know it's 1 minute left till the hour, but I just have a brief question to end up with, which is simply, what will you, I like to frame it as a parent, because then it becomes the most earnest answer in a way, but what will you tell your son about best practices for entering into the digital space and becoming a digital citizen? Like, what kinds of literacies are the most important for you to pass on to him in this moment in time when things are sort of up for grabs and there's all these issues we've laid out?
Yeah, my partner and I talk about that a lot. For us, like with screen time or with using the internet, it's like you have to be the one that's making it. So like always understand that if you're just passively using it, then there's probably some design behind that. So like my son loves to play this game on the iPad called Nico Atsume. I don't know if any of you have seen that, but it's these cats, and you basically, like, the cat comes and you're like, oh, let's give it like a treat, and if you, it's basically like Facebook's like, oh, did I get another like or a poke? And I hate it. I'm like, no, take that thing off the iPad. It's just habituating him to these practices. But he uses Scratch on the iPad, and he's like programming and making it, and it's great. And so sometimes you talk about that as the horse or the rider. Are you being ridden, or are you like riding the thing? And so for me, that's sort of what I would want to pass on. That it's a wonderful technology, and it does provide you with the ability to like craft your own experience or like say something out in the world. My daughter loves to like, she's in her own rock band, and she makes her own collages with it and does stop motion, and it's rad, and it's like objectively awesome that she has this like piece of glass that she can just like play any music or make anything she wants. And so that's great. But just understanding that dynamic between like when you're making with it and when it's using you, I think is something that I'm trying to instill.
All right, great way to end this. And thank you so much, Brett, and also everybody from Norway who stayed up till midnight.
Yeah, thank you.
Which is pretty incredible, and my students that came.
Thank
you so much. Okay, I'm going to stop the broadcast, but we'll be in this Hangout.